Well, thank you, Mark, for that very kind introduction. And yeah, it has been at least 20 years, probably longer than that. We don't want to really admit that, but I've known Mark for quite some time, so it's an honor to be introduced this morning by Mark. And I also have to say, I say this every year, but it is really such an honor for me to be invited back year after year to EDA. I want to thank the conference organizers for doing such a good job. I arrived here, it's a highlight of my year, it really is, to come to EDA. I arrive here, I'm treated like some sort of royalty. I don't have to worry about anything. You feed me. It's all just fantastic. And it's really great that I've gotten to know so many of you personally year after year and developing some very nice friendships within EDA. So I feel very much honored and at home to be here this morning, to talk to you this morning. I will talk a little bit about the book a little bit later on, but I did want to say that EDA is also a very nice, I guess, match for me to talk to, because the jurisdictions, the cities and towns across the province that you represent are those cities and towns that I visit frequently, and that I guess I represent or represent ATB to those cities and towns. And I do travel to many of your communities. In fact, this week I was in Bonnyville, Cold Lake, Stony Plain, Edmonton, Stony Plain again, Rocky Mountain House, Kananaskis today, and Red Deer tomorrow. So that's not quite a typical week for me, but I do get around the province and I try to visit as many towns and cities as I can. And I do hope, in fact, that some of you might give me a call sometime and take advantage of the fact that I am available to come and do presentations or come and do talks or seminars. That's exactly what ATB would like me to be doing. So I am a resource that's available to everyone throughout the province, and I would love to build some of those relationships with your own local economic development authorities. All right, on to what I want to talk about this morning. The title of my presentation, Alberta Economy 2012, A Game of Skill and Chance. Let's see how we forward this. Anyone remember what this game is? You have to be at least as old as me. Stock ticker, yeah. Some of you will know this immediately. But usually you have to be at least as old as me to remember this game. This is a game of stock ticker. Popular board game from the 50s and 60s. I don't know if people play it a whole lot anymore. However, I did get caught up in a game of stock ticker over the Christmas holidays up at my parents' place in Edmonton. And it kind of struck me that stock ticker really does a good job, in fact, mimicking what goes on in stock markets and commodity markets, the way things move up and down and you buy and trade stocks. Now, in the real world, there is a little bit more to it, obviously, than the game. But I thought there's some understanding that we can gain, some insight we can gain from a simple board game like this. So when I was thinking about the economy in 2012 and trying to put together my presentation for where things are going this year in the global economy and Canada, Alberta, I drew inspiration from my parents' game cupboard, because there's all these games, these board games and crazy things from the 60s and 70s that probably a lot of you will remember. And I drew inspiration from those. So what I'm going to do is talk about some of these interesting events going on around the global economy. There's never any lack of interesting situations to talk about. We're going to talk about a few places around the world. We're going to talk about Canada, the United States, obviously, and we're going to talk about Alberta. And for many of these situations, I'm going to pull a game out of the game cupboard to help give some insight, or maybe help us explain a little bit or understand a little bit better what's going on. So let's start first of all. Let's start this time in Asia and talk about China and the emerging Asian economies. Now, when we talk about the emerging Asian nations, we tend to lump them all together. But really, there's many distinct countries. They all have different kinds of economies. India is very different than Indonesia or South Korea or China. But I am going to focus my comments this morning on China. It is the largest of the emerging nations. By some forecasts, in fact, China will overtake the United States by the year 2020 in terms of the largest economy on Earth. So a lot obviously hangs in the balance with what goes on in China this year. Well, the game China is going to be playing is this one. Remember Twister? This was a wild party game of the 60s and 70s. Most of you would remember Twister. To be a good Twister player, you need three qualities. You need balance, you need flexibility, and it really helps if you're young. Youthfulness is an asset in the game of Twister. So does China's economy demonstrate those three qualities in 2012? Well, let's talk first of all about balance. The trick for the Chinese government and the central bank is to sort of balanced growth in China, right around 8 or 9% real GDP growth. And that's about where it's been over the last decade or so. Very rapid level of growth. If things ramp up too much faster than 8 or 9%, they run into problems with inflation and asset prices, and everything kind of runs away on it. However, if growth falls much below 8 or 7%, they're going to run into some social problems with not enough jobs being created to accommodate all of those migrants that are still moving from the rural regions of China to the cities. So the trick is to balance growth right around 8 or 9%. Most of the forecasts for 2012 put Chinese growth right around 8%, some 7.5, some a little bit higher. A little bit softer than what it's been over the last 10 years. And month to month, some information comes out of China that sort of disappoints on manufacturing, and then there's a good report. It bounces around. But overall, I think China will be able to maintain a balanced level of growth between about 7 and 8%. So I think it'll be okay that way. What about flexibility? The other quality, or one of the other qualities to be a good twister player. Well, in some respects, China's economy is very flexible. They're very good at ramping up and being able to respond to new technologies and new consumer demand. Flat-screen TVs weren't really a thing 10 years ago. And all of the manufacturing goods, the consumer goods that we here in North America and Europe buy, they're very good at flexibility that way. But in another way, they're not flexible at all, and that's with respect to its currency, the yuan. It has a managed peg against the US dollar. It's not an exchangeable currency, not like the Canadian dollar or these other currencies that trade freely in currency markets. So it's got a pegged currency with the US dollar. And of course, the United States, they've been harping on China for a long time, wanting more flexibility in that currency. They would like that yuan to appreciate, try to deal with some of those trade imbalances between the US and China. But I actually don't think we will be seeing much of that at all. Not much flexibility on its currency exchange rate, regardless of what the United States and the rest of the global community is saying. Finally, youthfulness. Is China young? Well, again, there's a couple of ways of looking at it. Its economy itself, its sort of modern economy is quite young. It's only about 30 years, in fact, since China opened the doors to global trade and modernized some of its capitalism and some of its business practices. So it's quite young that way. It's an emerging economy. It's got a lot of room to grow. But in another respect, China is not young, and that's the demographics. Its population is, in fact, growing older. More people leaving the workforce, or soon to be leaving the workforce, than younger people coming in. In fact, it's often said China will be the first country to grow old before it grows rich, unlike Europe and North America and Japan. So I think its demographics will work against China over the next 10 years, but I think certainly in 2012, China, along with the other emerging nations, this is where growth in the global economy is going to be concentrated. And I will come back and reference China one more time at the end of the presentation, specifically why Alberta has a lot of skin in the game with respect to China. So that's the good news. China's doing well. Well, now we're going to talk about some not so good news. We've got to talk about Europe. Oh, the Europeans and their drama. It's always something going on there. Well, lately, actually, the last couple of months, things were looking like they were improving a little bit. But the storyline remains the same. All of these southern Mediterranean countries, notably Greece, so much attention's been put on Greece, but increased scrutiny on Italy and Spain, Portugal, even Ireland. A lot of these countries, their government debt, their sovereign debt, unsustainably high, and real questions or fears that we might see some defaults on this government debt. Their economy not doing well. Germany and Northern Europe doing obviously much better, but Southern Europe and already in deep recession. Well, the game they're playing in Europe this year is this one. Remember Kerplunk? Kerplunk was a fantastic game for kids back in the 60s and 70s, and if you don't remember Kerplunk, there's only two things that can happen when it's your turn. So the trick is you've got to pull out one of those sticks. One possible outcome is nothing happens. That's actually the good news. All the marbles just kind of stay suspended there, and that's good. The other outcome, of course, is that the marbles start to fall down, and that's bad news. Nothing ever good happens in Kerplunk. It's either nothing or bad news. And that's kind of where Europe's economy is going to be in 2012. They're looking at very, very flat levels of growth, like I said, with Germany, sort of propping up the recession in Southern Europe. Either a flat level of growth or, more troublingly, a deeper continental recession. The little boy and the little girl in this picture, they're having a good time playing for fun. If you can think about those two as Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy, leaders of Germany and France, and they're playing global kerplunk with Europe's banking and financial system. The big game for them will be to preserve confidence, investor confidence in the European banking system. In other words, all those marbles hanging there are the financial system in Europe. And if there is a run of confidence on those European banks, because those banks, remember, have a lot of exposure to that bad government debt. And if people start to lose confidence in the ability of those banks, or the stability of those banks, we could see a run on those banks, which could trigger, this is sort of a worst case scenario, but it could trigger another sort of seizure of global credit markets, like we saw in 2008. And that year, of course, it was the Wall Street banks going down and global credit markets seized up very quickly and it affected Canada and the rest of the global economy. In 2012, there's a possibility that in fact those marbles start to fall and there's a lack of investor confidence in Europe and another global credit crisis. I don't think at this point that is the likeliest case scenario. In fact, I think Europe will kind of bumble its way through. But regardless, it is in for a very long period of stagnant growth with recession in the southern Mediterranean countries, possibilities still of some changes in membership of the euro currency, notably Greece. Germany, of course, doesn't want any of that to happen because it would sort of be an admission at that point that the euro experiment is maybe not working out quite as well as they had hoped. And Germany's put a lot of energy and invested a lot of sort of capital in making the euro currency work. So they don't want to see member countries leaving. My guess is that 2012 will be marked by very flat growth. Nothing dramatic. I don't think we will see a collapse in the European banking system, but it kind of lurks out there as a possibility. All right, let's talk about the United States, our BFFs, our largest trading partner. We always have to understand what's going on in the United States to understand what's going on in Canada and Alberta. And here the news is actually quite a lot better than it's been in the last 4 or 5 months. Most of those indicators in the United States are actually now showing some encouraging signs. Much different tone, even than when I was giving this presentation at the beginning of January. The tone now that we're into close to the middle of April is a lot brighter. And you almost feel these clouds lifting off the U.S. economy. Now, we don't want to get carried away. The U.S. is not growing at a pace that you would call normal. Nor is the unemployment rate anywhere as low as it should be. But the two big problems in the United States, the labor market and the housing market, in both of these we are seeing some encouraging signs. The housing market, those signs have been very, very timid, but at least they're pointing in the right direction. The rate of foreclosures in some of those states that were hit pretty badly, Arizona and Nevada, there's still foreclosures, but the rate of foreclosures is less. And in some of those states where, in fact, they weren't hit as hard, the Pacific Northwest and the mountain states, now we're seeing real estate prices on the rise again, gradually, but they're all moving in the right direction. So I think the best you can say is that the housing market in the United States has definitely seen the worst, and it is now on a very, very slow and gradual improvement. The labor market, a little bit better news there. In fact, the last 7 months in a row, the U.S. economy has been adding jobs. And it actually looks like it's gaining a little bit of momentum. Now, the very last month we have numbers for, the month of March, those numbers were a bit disappointing. Economists had hoped for 200,000 new jobs created. It only came in at about 120,000 new jobs, which was lower than what was hoped for, but at least it's still an increase in jobs. It's not a drop of 120,000 jobs. So for 7 months in a row, the U.S. economy adding jobs. They're all in the private sector. These are not government jobs being created anymore. But government is still shedding jobs. So all of that is encouraging. That unemployment rate's gone from 10.2% when Mr. Obama took office to 8.2% today. Still needs to fall about 3 more percentage points before you would say it's sort of a balanced labor market. But it's moving in the right direction. The game the United States is going to be playing this year is this one. Remember Operation? Operation is, unlike some of those other games, Operation is entirely a game of skill. There is no luck involved in operation. There's no dice. There's no drawing of cards. It takes a skillful hand. You know how it works. You got to go in there with those little tweezers and you got to remove the little bits of plastic, and you can't touch the side or you're going to light up the guy's nose, right? That's the game. Well, the U.S. Federal Reserve, for the last 4 years, they've had a task ahead of them, and their task has been to try to stimulate growth in the U.S. economy, and they've been using their tools, their tweezers, I guess, monetary policy, basically printing more money, or the rounds of quantitative easing that we've heard so much about, cutting interest rates to record low levels, doing everything they can to try to inject some life into the U.S. economy. So far, they have not really been successful. You can't say the U.S. economy is back to normal. So they have not yet achieved their goal. However, you could also say they have not yet screwed it up either. They haven't touched the side and lit up the guy's nose. And back in 2008, there were a lot of warnings on the Federal Reserve saying, you cannot print that much money. This quantitative easing and this cutting interest rates, this is going to end in disaster. This is going to end in runaway inflation, Zimbabwe style, and you're going to cause the U.S. dollar to collapse. Well, here, 4 years later, there's not a whiff of inflation in the U.S. economy. And the U.S. dollar is actually amazingly resilient, very stable, in fact, at the moment. So they have not yet achieved their goal, but they haven't screwed things up. There's still possibilities in the future of inflation kind of taking off. But the U.S. Federal Reserve, all eyes will remain on them in 2012 as they continue to try to pump some life into the U.S. economy. And Ben Bernanke, he is saying, well, a third round of quantitative easing, in other words, another pound of the paddle on the guy's chest, probably isn't going to be necessary at this point. And that's a good sign that he's saying a third round won't be necessary, because it does suggest the U.S. Federal Reserve sees enough growth in the U.S. economy that things should be able to get back to normal eventually without even more stimulus. So overall, I think the U.S. economy, 2012 will be a better year for it than was 2011, but still underperforming what you would call normal levels of growth in that country. Okay, let's talk about Canada, what's going on this side of the border. Last year, Canada had a bit of an up and down year. It started out not too bad. In fact, we were leading the G7 at the beginning of 2011. Then everything over the summer and fall kind of fell apart. And in November, in fact, Canada was in a bit of a contraction. Things came back a little bit in December, so it was a bit of an up and down year. But the big challenge for the Canadian economy has been concentrated in central Canada. And we're seeing a lot of economic challenge in Ontario and Quebec. Their manufacturing sector, they are having a hard time. Not only dealing with all of these changing trading patterns and the loss of manufacturing jobs, but the high Canadian dollar really does hold back Ontario's economy, and there's a lot of frustration there right now. We heard Mr. McGeety about 3 weeks ago. He kind of threw Alberta under the economic bus, and then he retracted all the statements and said, "I didn't really mean it." But you could kind of sense the guy's frustration, and I don't obviously approve of him saying bad things about Alberta. But in a lot of ways, he's right. That high Canadian dollar is holding back Ontario. And you can sense the frustration in the man's voice. He's trying to put together a provincial budget and their economy's not doing well. But the game Canada is going to be playing this year is this one. Anyone remember Ants in the Pants? Ants in the Pants is a fantastic game if you're 3 years old, or if you have a lot of gin. Otherwise, it's not a really compelling game. And the reason it's not a thinking person's game. It's really a game of luck. You flip the ant and you try to land the ant in the pants, and that's all there is really to the game. Not a whole lot more to it. And that's sort of where Canada is. I don't want to suggest that our policymakers don't have some very important decisions. But Canada, we really are playing more of a game of luck in 2012 because we are so dependent on what's going on in the global economy. Obviously, the United States affects our economy. The global headwinds and the trouble in Europe and the financial system there is affecting Canada. And even the growth prospects of the emerging Asian economies affects Canada, notably those commodity prices. And we don't have any control over these external factors. So in some ways, we just kind of have to hunker down and hope that the global economy sort of pulls itself together in 2012 and lifts the Canadian economy. There are certain things, in fact, within our own domestic control, and some policymakers will be looking at these, notably around household debt. This has been the number one concern every time Mark Carney opens his mouth, he kind of gets on this, household debt's too high. The federal government a little worried about it, worried about perhaps some real estate bubbles building in Toronto and Vancouver, notably. So we may see some changes. In fact, I would anticipate some changes to that CMHC, the mortgage lending, probably lowering that amortization to 25 years. I think we could anticipate that in 2012. Some policy measures around trying to sort of make sure household debt, in fact, doesn't rise any further or get out of control. But overall, I think the Canadian economy, Central Canada will continue to lag in 2012, and Western Canada will be the focus of growth. Which leads me then to, anyone know what building this is? The Edmontonians will know. This is the AGA, the Art Gallery of Alberta, downtown Edmonton. The Calgarians usually scratch their head and look at this, and I don't know what that is. But this is the new Art Gallery of Alberta. And I'm using this as my, I guess, iconic slide of Alberta because it is a very unusual building. It looks a bit like some, spacecraft that's from space that crashed in Churchill Square Park. I think it's a beautiful building, but it's an unusual building, and Alberta's economy is actually in a very unusual place right now. We came sailing through 2011 in very, very good shape. As we heard last night, half of the new jobs created in all of Canada were created in this province. 98,000 full-time private sector jobs. Those are exactly the kinds of jobs economists like to see. And when you talk about half the jobs in the country, we only account for 12% of the population of Canada. So there's no question Alberta last year was the jobs engine of the country. And we're seeing that interprovincial migration picking up, more people moving to Alberta. The final estimates for GDP growth, we don't quite have the official estimates from Stats Canada yet, but it was probably around 3.84% real GDP growth. And when you think about everything that's gone on in 2011, for part of, never mind Asia, but for a modern, developed economy like Alberta's, to be growing at 4% is pretty remarkable. The main reason, of course, why we performed so well last year, well, there's no big surprise, it's this right here. You guys are a smart crowd, you know the game. We are very much a resource-dependent province, this resource particularly. That's not to diminish the contributions of agriculture, which were also notable in 2011. Sometimes we forget about agriculture and the contributions there. Agriculture was a very, very strong supporting industry in 2011. But nonetheless, crude oil kind of steals the show a lot of the times. Prices for crude oil in 2011, there again, it was a bit of a roller coaster. It was kind of soft over the summer and early fall. In fact, I remember the 1 week in September of 2011, oil prices went from $85 to $73 within like 3 days. And downtown Calgary, you just about see blood draining out of people's heads because they did not know what this was. It felt a little bit, again, like that collapse in energy prices we suffered in 2008. However, it did not result in that. It hit $73 one afternoon, and then it turned around and started climbing. And by the end of the year, that North American benchmark price, that West Texas Intermediate, was trading at $100 US a barrel. And it's been remarkably stable, given everything that's going on right now. Oil prices have been pretty stable, around $100 US for that West Texas, for the last 5 months. And in fact, it seems like a high price, but North American is actually suffering or enjoying, depends who you are. But prices in North America are actually considerably lower than what they are in Europe right now, for a variety of different reasons. But nonetheless, at $100 oil, this province is doing well. Investment in the oil sands, conventional oil, non-conventional oil plays, a lot of activity, and you guys are seeing this in your towns and communities. It's one thing to talk about where oil prices were last year, but what we want to know is where oil prices are going. Well, here, the game is this one, snakes and ladders. Remember this game? Unlike Operation now, Snakes and Ladders is entirely a game of chance. There is no skill at all. That's why it's a great game for the whole family, because no one has any advantage. There's no strategy. You roll the dice and hope for the best, and that's all you can do in Snakes and Ladders. Now, I don't want to suggest that our energy resources, that there's not some skill and planning and strategy with how we develop those resources. Absolutely there is. But when you consider Alberta as a price taker, there's nothing we can do in this province to influence those North American or those global prices. The price is the price. It's set by factors outside our control, so we take whatever price we get, and it is often a roll of the dice. And in 2012, there will be some ladders and there will be some snakes that will push prices higher or lower. And what are some of those ladders and snakes? Well, the ladders, the big ladder at the moment is the situation in the Middle East. And that is, in fact, why oil prices, especially European oil prices, are very high at the moment. Turmoil and instability, political conflict, and all sorts of nastiness in the Middle East is keeping pushing those oil prices higher. I'm not a geopolitical expert, but I don't know of any experts who would suggest that in 2012, all of this is going to wrap up nicely and all the tensions are going to go away. In fact, if anything, I think it will be the opposite. I think tensions are escalating in 2012. And that will continue to put upward pressure on prices. $120, $130, $150 a barrel is possible, especially if Iran starts to dust off nuclear weapons and start pointing them at people. There's just really no saying what can happen in the Middle East. Hard to predict. On the downside, there are some snakes out there which could influence prices lower. What are some of those? Well, getting back to Europe and their financial game of kerplunk, if we were to see a run in European banks, and if we did see a collapse there and another repeat of global credit markets seizing up, that would certainly drag Europe into recession and likely the United States into recession. And if we lose Europe and the United States, we're going to lose Asia and China particularly. Maybe not to an outright recession, but growth in China will go from 8 or 9% to 3 or 4%, and they will be demanding and consuming far less oil. In that sort of scenario, $60 oil, $50 oil is very, very possible. So what's it going to be? $50 oil, $150 oil? It is a game of snakes and ladders. We don't know with certainty. But my guess is, at this point, that the ladders are stronger than the snakes, at least where we're sitting right now. In other words, the possibilities of increased turmoil and tension in the Middle East is more likely than a collapse of the European banking system. So given that, my best guess for oil prices is that we're going to continue to see it trading close to where it's at now, probably a little higher. So for that North American benchmark price, probably between $100 and $120 US a barrel. If that holds up, that is actually a very favorable price environment for Alberta producers, and I think we'll put this province in a very good situation. All right, another big topic we've got to talk about are these pipelines. Who would have thought that something as typically mundane as pipeline utilities would rise to the #1 business news story of 2011 in this province? Usually there's not nearly so much attention to pipeline transmission, but in 2011, of course, there was. The Keystone XL pipeline, now the Northern Gateway pipeline, these are big news stories. And they're noteworthy because all of a sudden there's question marks if they're going to proceed or not. Over the last 40 or 50 years in this province, there's been a few exceptions, but generally if you need a pipeline put in place, well, pipeline goes in the ground, and there's some paperwork to fill out and some incidental hearings, but it was never really a question. Again, there's been some exceptions to that, but it was never really a question if the pipelines would go ahead. Now there are questions if these pipelines will proceed or not. And the game we're playing here is this one. Remember Story? Yeah. If you haven't played Story, the game of Story, you got to move your little token around the game board, and out of the blue, without justification, someone hands you a Story card. And it's very frustrating because if you get handed a story card, you got to start at the beginning. You got to move your token all the way back to the start. And it's, you did nothing to deserve this, but that's just the way it goes. And Alberta, at least Alberta's energy industry, was dealt a story card by Mr. Obama in October. And another one in January saying, sorry, Keystone, I don't even know if he said sorry, but he just said, Keystone XL, we are not approving this project, at least not in its current form. Now, there was a change. There has been a bit of a development over the last 3 weeks or so when, in fact, Mr. Obama did announce that the southern piece of Keystone, from Cushing, Oklahoma to the Gulf, that piece of it is now given approval. I'm not even really sure why. The White House doesn't need to approve that piece. It doesn't cross up an international border. Nonetheless, I think Mr. Obama was sending a message, and the message was Keystone eventually will proceed. We're approving the southern piece of it now. And I think he was sending a message to industry in the United States and to Americans that we do need Canadian oil, and this project is eventually going ahead. So get used to it. That is actually very positive news for Alberta. But nonetheless, right now, that pipeline from Hardisty to Cushing has not yet been approved. and the Northern Gateway Pipeline. This was supposed to be the simpler of the two projects. It seems now there's some real questions about if this is going ahead. I understand, the Chinese, they're very interested in receiving our crude oil or our bitumen. And I guess there's been some surprise in China saying, what, you're still not done that pipeline? It's been 6 months already. Why is this pipeline not already built? I mean, it just confounds them. And I don't suggest we go to a system in China where there's no consultation at all. Fortunately, we do live in Canada where democracy and rights are respected. But that does come at a cost, and the cost is, delays of some projects, and possibly, the project won't be approved. I don't want to make any speculation on either pipeline. I don't want to guess if they'll be approved or not. But what I would say is we are in a new era in this province with pipelines, wherein we can't assume if these pipelines will proceed. Like I said, over the last 50 years, you can make that assumption. But now I think it's sort of contingent, or it's up to the energy industry to maybe come up with some contingency plans, some plan Bs and plan Cs and plan Ds, and this is where it's going to take maybe some creative thinking about how, in fact, we can get product to market. If someone moves our cheese. Anyone read that book, Who Moved My Cheese? Yeah. Well, the energy industry should be reading this book because their cheese is moving around. So it's going to take some creative thinking. I certainly think that the energy industry obviously has a bright future in the province. But this does create some changing game plans a little bit for them. Okay, finally, the residential real estate market. Everyone usually is interested. If you're not a buyer or a seller at any given point, most of us, at some point in our adult lifetime, we hold some real estate as an asset. So we're always interested in knowing where are real estate prices going, what's going on there. Well, the game I think we're playing in residential real estate this year is this one, Scrabble. I would say if you want to kill a party and send everyone home, pull up the Scrabble board. Maybe Jerry should have pulled it out last night. Hospitality, that would have sent everyone. And it's not to say that Scrabble is not a good game. In fact, of all the games I've talked about, Scrabble is without question my favorite game. It's just not a hard game. It's not a wild, no riots are breaking out over a game of Scrabble. It's a very slow game, especially if you play with my brother. It just takes forever sometimes. But you got to think your way through Scrabble. There's strategy involved. It's a slow, it kind of plods along, but there's a lot of strategy. It's never the long word that wins in Scrabble. It's all about the short words. It's all about the triple word score, and it's all about the letter S. And if you know that about Scrabble, that's the strategy right there. Real estate in Alberta, without exception, the developers and home builders I'm talking to, they've all got projects on the go. In fact, home starts are trending upward again. The last month we have numbers for March. We're still way below the record-setting years of 06 and 07. So you can look at those years and say, well, we're still like 30% below those peaks. But if you look at the 10-year average, we're right around the 10-year average. So I would say that there's a lot of stability. Home builders, they're putting product on the market, but they're being a little bit more strategic. They're being a little bit more cautious this time. They're not putting far too much product on the market. They're not building like crazy. I think maybe they learned some lessons from 06 and 07. I would describe the pace of activity and the price environment as being pretty stable right now. Some might say flat. That's a pessimistic word. Flat, I say stable. I don't think we're going to see big changes in prices, none for new homes or for existing homes. There might be some upward pressure on existing home prices in 2012 because, as I mentioned earlier, Alberta is now once again receiving provincial migrants, and that will put some upward pressure on demand. On the other side, if we do see some of those changes to CMHC, that could take a little bit of the wind out of the sail of real estate, especially at that entry level. But on balance, I think we're going to see a pretty stable market. If anything, probably some gradual upward movement in price. And I think that's actually a very good place to be. So just to kind of summarize, what's the game plan then for Alberta in 2012? I think we're going to see moderate economic growth. Just a shade slower, in fact, in 2011. Now, the takeaway from that is positive. I don't want you going away thinking, oh, growth is slowing down. Faster is not always better. And if we had 4% growth last year, 4.5% growth this year is not really where we want to be. We found out in 06 and 07 what happens when growth ramps up too fast. I think what we'll see is growth between 3 and 3.5% real GDP. Very nice, moderate level of growth. I think something that will provide some stability, not runaway growth, a shade slower than last year, but a very favorable, very enviable rate of growth. Oil, as always, will be the wild card. Those agricultural commodity prices as well will obviously support it. And I think there we're looking at strong, at least stable commodity prices across the board. But it is for oil prices particularly, it is a game of snakes and ladders. We don't know where those prices are going to be. China will be the most critical country for Alberta to watch, not the United States. Now that's not to imply that the U.S. is not our largest trading partner. Obviously they are, and they always will be. In fact, we trade very little with China. But why China is so critical right now is because it is China and Asia that's keeping these commodity prices, these global prices, where they're at. And if we were to somehow lose China to a downturn, we would lose those commodity prices. So China's growth is a critical piece of it this year. Finally, Alberta, along with our sidekick Saskatchewan, these two provinces will continue to lead the growth in the country. We will see more of that westward shift, the economic momentum moving more towards Western Canada, and the prairie provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan particularly. And if all goes as planned in 2012, what we will avoid is this game. We don't have to be playing this game. The pop-o-matic dice, trouble. And a lot of places around the world are still going to be facing very, very serious economic and political challenges. You think about Spain. The unemployment rate's 24%. And for young people in Spain, it's 45%. It's hopeless, really. Or Greece, where their economy is really collapsing around there, right in front of their eyes. Or the Middle East, the political turmoil. And even places still in the United States and central Canada. A lot of economic challenges. But I think Alberta is in a very enviable position right now. I think we're going to see a very nice level of economic growth. I'm sensing that even at this conference, that the level of optimism is better, much better than it was 2 or 3 years ago, certainly. And probably of the 5 years I've been part of the EDA, you just sense the energy in the room and the optimism. And as I travel around the province, it leads me to kind of believe that Alberta, our growth in 2012 will be very good, a very enviable place to be. And with that, I will conclude. Most of you probably already know about the daily economic comment that we prepare. My army of economists, well, I have one other guy that works with me, so it's a small but mighty army. So we put together the daily economic comment every day, and then Fridays, you better be doing that right now, actually, we put together the weekly bulletin. And it's always focused on what's going on in Alberta's economy, and that's where we really feel ATB can make a contribution. The other banks, they actually do have real armies of economists. And they put together all kinds of really great information. But ATB, we can focus on what's going on in this province particularly. So if you want to check that out, you can go to atb.com and look for the little button that says Economics and Research. And then finally, I will talk a little bit about my cute little book here, The Boiling Frog Dilemma, Saving Canada from Economic Decline. I did co-write this with my long-time friend and former colleague Robert Roach from the Canada West Foundation. And as Mark said, it tries to answer one fundamental question, and that is, what creates wealth in the economy? And we argue it's not hydrocarbons in the ground that create wealth, and it's not a chicken slaughtering factory or an auto assembly plant in Oshawa. What creates wealth is the power of new ideas. And we heard Annette last night talk a little bit about that too. And this book, unlike most other books around the economy, most of the time when you have an economist write a book about the economy, usually there's something in it about, well, the government needs to do this, or the government needs to do that, or we need the government to give us tax credits for research. The government is responsible for making us creative. And we're saying that's hogwash. Absolutely, government framework is important. But if you want to become a creative, innovative, risk-taking, entrepreneurial person or business, you got to really do it yourself. You can't wait for the government to give you a tax credit to do it. So this book, in some ways, it was described by somebody as a manifesto, which sounds a little bit more, violent or something. But we're kind of throwing down the gauntlet, saying, come on, Canada, if we want to be a world leader, if we want to be the place in the world where people come to find out how are the Canadians doing. They are creative, they are innovative, they are risk-taking, they're cosmopolitan, entrepreneurial. There are some specific actions we have to take. That's hence the name, the boiling frog. We've got to be the frog that's jumping out of the pot of water that's gradually heating up on us, or actually quite rapidly heating up on us. We say Canada, we've done very, very well over the last 150 years. years, we don't get to be Canada, a very desirable place to live, regularly ranked among the very top in the world in terms of places to live. Well, we didn't get there by accident. However, the world has changed on us, and what we did over the last 150 years is going to take some creative changing. And we can't be afraid to change. So if you're interested in the book, I'll be around during the break, and I'll stick around for a little bit longer. They're $25. 3 reasons why, in fact, you'll be happy to buy it today. One is, when you see me on the Land and O'Leary Exchange, and Kevin O'Leary is giving me a hard time about the book on May 2nd, you'll think, oh, I should have bought that book. So now another reason is, if you buy it today, you'll avoid paying GST, which you'd have to pay in a store if you go and buy it. And the third reason is, we're actually going to the second edition, which won't change in content, but this will be a collector's item. So if you want to buy it, I've turned into a shameless entrepreneur item. If you want to buy it, come and talk to me later. But with that, I do thank you very much for your kind attention. Do we have time, Jerry, for if there are any questions or if you've got some comments? First,
with Provost, Alberta, one of the biggest things that's affecting us right now is that our unemployment rate is definitely down below 4%. And I'm just wondering if you've got any kind of quick comments or suggestions on where companies should go to look for.
Oh, yeah, that's a fantastic question. And labor shortages, especially in places like Provost and North, labor shortages are already the #1 problem. I wish I had an easier answer to that question. Attracting labor attracting labor to Alberta at all is increasingly difficult. International migration, there's possibilities there. That doesn't come without some costs, though. I mean, there's relocation costs and there's cultural differences. And so I don't know if I have a very easy answer to that, but I think it's got to be a combination of making your community a desirable place for people to move to, and perhaps working with the provincial and federal governments in terms of targeting those international migrants. But that's a big question for a lot of communities.
So are the labor shortages in Canada that, there's a possibility of you mentioned that kind of our strategy this year is to work mostly at Ontario, where some of the pockets are still up around 8 or 10%.
Yeah.
That's the best strategy that we found.
Yeah, Ontario, there's all kinds of possibilities. And we tend to think of Saskatchewan and Newfoundland as the provinces that have fed Alberta's interprovincial migration. By far, it's been Ontario over the last 10 years. It's not even close. The size of Ontario has kind of, helped with that. The problem is, labor mobility in Canada, yeah, people can move, but if you're in sort of a household situation and one income earner is without money or a job, it's hard to uproot a whole family sometimes and do that. It wasn't so difficult in the 60s and 50s when it was usually just one income earner. Now there's generally 2 income earners. So if one person in Ontario is out of work, and the other person in the household is working, it's a harder decision to say, well, we're both going to, move to Alberta and start over. So it makes that labor mobility a little bit more difficult. But yeah, generally Ontario, there should be a lot of opportunities for migrants in that province. Yeah.
Natural gas.
Oh boy. I knew it was coming, and the mayor of Okotoks took me aside this morning, and he said, I wrote this down last year, you said natural gas prices were going to go up. But I did say, he wrote it down. But it did say in there over the next 2 or 3 years, so I've got a little bit of wiggle room. It's only been 1 year. Yeah, I've been surprised, in fact, with more or less the collapse of natural gas prices. I thought they would stabilize and gradually claw their way back up. And my general response for that is, it's too nice of a morning to talk about natural gas. That's like oil. No, natural gas has been a real challenge, and now I'm kind of at the point of saying, it could be 3 to 5 years, in fact, before we see any improvements. There's just far too much supply coming out of the U.S. economy. For, I guess, students of basic economics, this is a classic supply and demand problem. Too much supply, not enough demand. So what we need to have is, the supply equation is not going to change. There's so much gas coming out of the U.S. We need demand to pick up. Industrial demand in the United States, it hasn't picked up yet, nor have we been able to get at those Asian markets. Once we start having the facilities in place for LNG, we can export it, we can, that increases then demand. So over the next 3 to 5 years, I'm in the longer run sort of bullish on natural gas, but 2012, it's not going to be a good story. Yeah.
I think we're discussing too much about agriculture. I was just wondering what you thought about the two things: the prospect of agriculture in the future, and secondly, farmland as an investment.
Yeah, well, agriculture, I didn't really say too much about it, but it has performed very, very well in 2011. Everything seems to have lined up in terms of prices, both on the crop side and on the livestock side. And then on the crop side, I mean, the growing conditions, I'm not a farmer, but every farmer I talked to in 2011, they said this is the best harvest we've seen. Nice, warm, dry conditions. Now, you can't count on a repeat of the climate conditions, and it's pretty dry up there right now. Notwithstanding today, but most parts of the province could really use some moisture. I think prices will hang in there nicely, though. Farm land prices, I don't know if we're going to continue to see the same kinds of increases that we've seen in Alberta. I think they'll still trend higher, but probably at a slower pace. I think Saskatchewan farm prices there, they've got a lot of catching up to do, and I think there'll be more probably investment and more buying in Saskatchewan. But that said, I think Alberta farm prices will continue to trend higher, just not the same kinds of big jumps for sure. Yes, Mark.
From an economic point of view, what are your thoughts on the outcome of the provincial election?
I'm not sure what election you're referring to. I didn't know there was one. No, I can't really comment. Mark knows I can't comment about this. I work for a Crown Corporation. So I can't comment on particular parties or, the outcome. But what I would say is, the two parties at this point that have a chance of forming government, reasonable people can argue over, kind of the direction or some of the ideologies of both parties. And there are some clear differences there. And like I said, you can debate about those things. But I don't think under either party, this province isn't going to be going in some wildly different direction. So economically, I think the momentum in this province is so strong that it would take, how do I want to say this? It would take some party that's not one of those two parties. to really derail things. I should probably just stop talking. So the long and short of it is, I think we'll be fine. Thank you very much.